President Donald Trump saving West Coast states from the stupidity of misguided climate policies that sound really nice but don't do anything at all. Let's talk about it. This segment is brought to you in partnership with our friends at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Okay, so this requires a little bit, I think, of some background here because it goes back to like the 1960s. I won't get too into the weeds, but here's the headline you might have seen from the Seattle Times. Washington, other states sue Trump administration for blocking EV policies. So let me try to explain it in a nutshell. Back in 1967, states like California, they wanted to have clean air regulations that were more stringent than the federal government. But they needed a waiver from the EPA in order to do it. So back in the late 1960s, the federal government and the EPA started handing out these waivers to say, okay, California, you can have some of these clean air regulations that are more strict than the federal government. And so as a result of that, states like Washington and some other states started to sort of base their policies on those regulations that California received. So part of what they're doing, phasing out in California at a really extreme pace, trying to phase out gas-powered vehicles and have these insane, not even achievable EV mandates and EV goals, similar in Washington state, where you want to incentivize and then even force people into electric vehicles, even though for a lot of people it doesn't make sense with their lifestyle. And as I've said about a lot of these environmental policies, like, I love the environment, cool, yay, let's protect it. But if you love the environment, you should want the government doing things that are actually going to help the environment, A, and B, that are feasible. I mean, Jay Inslee, the climate governor, before he left office, set all these goals for 20, 30 years in the future on carbon emissions and EVs. They're not even attainable. But it sounded nice, right? And then he got to say, oh, I'm the climate governor. And then he ran for president as the climate presidential candidate. When in 20, 30 years, we're going to realize that none of that stuff is going to come to fruition. So what did President Donald Trump do? Well, in essence, they've sort of revoked these waivers and said, no, the state of California, you can't have these insane EV mandates that far exceed regulations from the federal government. Here's President Donald Trump signing the EV rollback.
Lower prices, better cars. And choice, you can say choice. We have choice for education, and you have choice for cars now, right? Common sense is right. You're right. Common sense is right.
Common sense. We love it. By the way, that made it to his desk for a signature on a bipartisan basis. There are even Democrats in these West Coast states who realize that these EV mandates aren't reasonable, they're not rational, they're not attainable, and they're not fair. For a lot of working class people, driving up the cost of vehicles, taking away their choice about what kind of vehicle they want to drive. But of course, our attorney general and the attorney general in California, they only work for the ideologues. They don't work for you and I. They don't work for the working class. And so now they're suing the Trump administration over it. Attorney General Nick Brown saying transportation is the single greatest contributor to greenhouse gas pollution in Washington. Our residents understand the transition to zero emission vehicles is critical in the fight against climate change. This is the Trump administration's latest unlawful attempt to derail Washington and the nation's transition to a clean future, blah, blah, blah. So again, like I'm all for smart climate policy, and I think most people are, but when you hear that from Nick Brown and he blames it on the president, keep in mind, this was bipartisan. This was a bipartisan decision. There was even one Democratic member of Congress in our state who sided with Republicans on it, a bipartisan decision to roll back these EV mandates and to have a more common sense climate policy. So one of the big backers of this was Congressman Michael Baumgartner from Washington State's 5th Congressional District. He joins us today on Undivided. Congressman, welcome back to Undivided.
Thank you, Brandi. It's always great to be on with you.
Yeah, so this EV issue, fascinating. I know Donald Trump said he'd sort of try to help us out with some of these nonsense environmental policies. So what does this mean for Washington State moving forward?
Well, it's huge for Washington State. Essentially, Governor Jay Inslee, with his environmental extreme viewpoint, had outsourced environmental policy to radical California. The net result was people in Washington State were, if not for what we just did with President Trump in Congress, people in Washington State were going to be forced to have a lack of choice in what kind of cars they drove, and were going to be forced into electric vehicles. Particularly concerning was the mandate for big rig semi-trucks, and EV semi-trucks don't practically exist, nor does the infrastructure to charge them. So if not for what we just did with President Trump to overturn this EV mandate, to take Governor Inslee and Governor Newsom's absurd policies and put them in a ball and throw them in the circular file, folks would have had a significant increase in their cost of goods. So it was a really big day. Probably the single biggest thing that this Congress has done so far was to overturn this California and Washington EV mandate.
Yeah, and I mean, now the legal wrangling begins, and of course, Washington State and California are going to be part of trying to fight back against that together. Or do you think that they have a case?
Well, if they win, we might as well just shut down the republic. I mean, this was a piece of legislation that was passed by a majority votes in both the House and the Senate and signed by the president. So I have no idea, other than just posturing from an environmentally extreme position, why Washington State would be suing. I mean, this is under the Constitution. This is the way that laws are supposed to be passed. And so I think as the lawsuits work their way through, that we'll be in good shape.
Yeah, it's worth pointing out. I mean, you guys had in our state, among our congressional delegation, it was a bipartisan vote. Congresswoman Marie Gluesenkamp-Perez, down in the 3rd, a Democrat, voted with Republicans on this. Is that correct?
That's right. And all we're saying is people ought to be able to drive the car they want to drive. If you want to drive an EV, drive an EV. If you want to drive a hybrid, drive a hybrid. If you want to drive a traditional gas combustion engine, be able to drive that. But like so many of these, the impact of so much of this environmental extremism is really aimed at working class folks, the poor, middle class, and life has gotten so expensive now, and these mandates are so detrimental to working class folks. And in America, if you're somebody that has a home that you own and you have money in the stock market, you can absorb this kind of stuff a lot better. But if you're a renter, someone that relies on used cars, someone that doesn't have a lot of money in stocks, these extreme environmental measures that push up the cost of goods, push up your groceries, they're extremely challenging. And so it's fantastic, quite frankly, that the signature achievement of Governor Inslee and Governor Newsom was essentially dismantled by what we did. And all those of your listeners that worked for Republicans to be elected should really take a victory lap here. This is what victory looks like. And it was great to be at the White House with the president for the bill signing.
Yeah, and I also would say to the kind of environmentalists, because I don't think it's a bad thing to love our planet and to want to save it and all of that, but to me, there really was no indication that these goals or mandates were even feasible. I mean, you mentioned it with sort of the EV big rigs, which are basically non-existent, but also, California had this sort of goal of, a certain number of vehicles being EV, one of these random 2035 or 2045 when, the people who pass it will be dead and gone from the earth and never have to. I mean, was it even for the people who actually thought maybe this was a good idea? I mean, there really wasn't an indication that these goals were even plausible, right?
That's right. It's posturing. It allows elected officials today to go to ribbon cuttings and pat themselves on the back and demonstrate to the small extreme environmental base they have amongst the Democratic Party that they're a champion for them. And look, in Washington State, Governor Gary Locke said he wanted to be the most environmentally conscious governor in our country's history. Governor Gregoire said the exact same thing. And then Governor Inslee was the most environmentally extreme governor. And so you go from a situation where, you have some pretty good stuff, but by the end it gets so extreme and so unworkable. And you think about the semi trucks, which just don't exist. Idaho and Utah were never going to build the charging infrastructure to support these trucks. And so essentially with this EV mandate on big rigs, you're locking trucks into up and down the West Coast. And that's just not how the trucking industry works. And you can say, well, okay, tough for the truckers. Well, that's the groceries you consume. That's the clothes you consume. That's the pencils that your kid uses to take to school. Literally everything that our economy runs on is essentially moved by truck. And so it has huge implications. And so, having practical reality, and I don't see it at all that Republicans should take a back seat on environmental policy, but it has to be, with common sense and views, and it has to be with consumer choice. And so that's essentially what we did here. For anybody but Jay Inslee and Gavin Newsom, this was a very common sense piece of legislation, but it was a huge win for the American people.
Yeah, agreed. So thanks for all your help with that. I think you got a shout out from the president. So
I did. It was fun to be at the White House. Get a little shout out from President Trump and celebrate that bill signing.
Yeah, really quickly, because I know you're really in solid footing on foreign affairs. You know, everybody's watching what's happening between Israel and Iran. I want to ask you first about the president's posture on this. You know, he's taken a very hard line. I mean, God, he was posting on social media for 10 million people, telling them to get out of Tehran, and I was like, what do you think is the best outcome in this situation?
Well, the best outcome would be for Iran, the leaders of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which are a messianic group of people that believe that the 12th Shia Imam is going to come back and deliver a Shia domination for the Middle East and throughout the world. That's really their mindset. But the best outcome would they be to give up their nuclear weapons program. And this is really, in my view, President Trump at his best. You know, the strategic ambiguity that he brings to the fore. You know, the single best thing he did in his first term was to assassinate Iranian terrorist leader Qasem Soleimani. About 20% of the Americans that were killed in the war in Iraq were killed by Iranian-backed terrorist groups, and including some folks that I know. And so, these are not good guys. They're the number one supporter of terrorism throughout the country. The Iranian people in general are very Western-oriented and are good people, but they have this terrible group of leaders. And if Iran were to get a nuclear weapon, it would mean that Saudi Arabia would get a nuclear weapon, Egypt would get a nuclear weapon, and Turkey would get a nuclear weapon, and probably the United Arab Emirates. And none of them would have what's called second strike capability. So they would all have the incentive to use a nuclear weapon first. And our world cannot survive those Middle East regimes all having nuclear weapons. It is too dangerous. And so it is so important that Iran not get a nuclear weapon. And I think the president, with his bold leadership on this issue and his strategic ambiguity, hopefully will put the Iranians in a situation where they will fully negotiate to fully dismantle their nuclear weapons program.
Yeah, if they're not willing, I mean, he gave them 60 days, and it was the 61st day that Israel started to carry out attacks. And so I guess, if they're not willing to just, put their hands in the air and surrender, how far are you willing to have the United States get involved? I mean, are you willing, because this is an issue right now that's fracturing the Republican base and conservatives, many of whom don't want to see U.S. involvement directly, certainly no troops. So how far are you willing to go as a member of Congress?
Well, we need to do what it takes to make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. And look, I've seen firsthand, as you know, I was in both Iraq and Afghanistan. I've seen firsthand the unrealistic nature of what we tried to do under the Bush administration, which was to spread Jeffersonian democracy as a means to quell radical Islamic terrorism. And it was an effort that was not workable. But we also learned a lot from the issue. But we cannot have this naive view that we can just sit home, be isolationist, and that there's a big scary world out there that if America is not present in it, other bad actors will be. And so, while I would love it if we could spend our resources all at home and not have to be in places like the Middle East, it's just not realistic in terms of the threats of Islamic terrorism, how interconnected our economy. So we have real strategic U.S. interests there, and we need to make sure they don't get a nuclear weapon. And I'm heartened that the president is showing that determination as well.
So just to be clear, because of course war powers rest with you in the Congress, and this would be the first such vote that you would have to take as a member of Congress. If it came down to that, you would vote in favor of U.S. troop involvement.
We will do what it takes to make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon. It is too dangerous for the world to have multiple regimes with nuclear weapons. And folks should go back and watch their Cold War era films about how dangerous nuclear weapons are. And to have nuclear weapons on the loose in countries that have vibrant Islamic terrorists, transnational Islamic terrorists, is extremely, extremely dangerous.
So that's a yes. That's a yes, just to be clear.
Yeah, we will do what it takes to make sure Iran does not have a nuclear weapon.
All right, Congressman Baumgartner, we appreciate your time. Two very different topics today, but
That's
thank you so much for taking the time
thanks,
to join
Brandi.
us. Yeah.
Great to see you. And I'm glad that you're looking so good as usual after what you went through with the protests in Seattle. And it's really unfortunate. We got to get Seattle cleaned up as well, too. So we're working on that issue.
That's an issue we need to have you back on to talk about.
Yeah,
we're going to get help from the feds in Seattle.
Yeah.
So I do appreciate that. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Again, Congressman Michael Baumgartner of Washington's 5th Congressional District, a Republican, and I did talk to him offline a little bit about just reiterating our call to try to get some help to deal with the violent left-wing extremism from the federal government. So I know that's something he's interested in as well, but circling back to the point of having him on, the EV mandate thing is good. I'm always worried about the courts. I don't know, it's hard-pressed to find a judge that isn't a left-wing ideologue, certainly in the Ninth Circuit as well. And so I don't know if it's how the Supreme Court would rule on it, but it's a good step for now. And it's good not only for working class people, but it's good for environmentalists as well. For people who truly care about the environment, you should want the government and all its focus on those issues to be on policies that are attainable and that actually work. That segment was brought to you in partnership with our friends at Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. Find ways to get involved by signing up for their newsletter. Again, Future 42.